Welcome back for week 3 out of 6 on American history from the Revolution up to through the Civil War. Welcome back from our winter break. I hope you all had fun going skiing or whatever people do on winter breaks. And the schedule, at this point, the schedule is easy to remember because it's just the same time, same day of the week for the rest of the month. So we have, after today, there'll be 3 more Wednesdays. Now, wait, thank you. That's a good idea. I have to say I'm missing all those plants. They were kind of cool. What happens to poinsettias at the end of the season, do you think? But where do they go? Do they just live somewhere, or are they well, who knows? Okay, welcome back. Last time we got ourselves through having the Constitution adopted, ratified, and we left the United States getting ready to get started under a new form of government. And almost immediately after the ratification became effective, it was time to start having a presidential election. There was absolutely no surprise about who was going to win, and in fact, George Washington got every single electoral vote, which is pretty much what was expected. You have a contemporary portrait of him there, and the engraving is him taking the oath of office at the Federal building that used to be in downtown New York. I don't think it's there anymore. It is? Excuse me. People who know New York better. Okay, well, I'm glad to know it's still there. Okay, so Congress had to start doing things to get the government running, and it created a few, well, actually, I will say this first. It took a while for enough members of Congress to arrive in New York, which was the capital at the time, before Congress could actually have a formal session. And you can decide for yourselves whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, but the first formal session of Congress was April Fool's Day in 1789. Now, so Congress had to do some things to create the rest of the government. It created a few small departments, a war department to handle the very small army, a department to handle the money, which became known as the Treasury Department, and another department that kind of was going to handle everything else, domestic affairs and foreign affairs, which became known as the State Department. The State Department doesn't get to do all of those things anymore, but it took time for that to happen. And Washington picked some of the best available talent to be in charge of those departments. He put Jefferson in charge of the State Department, and Alexander Hamilton, who probably knew more about public finance than anyone else on the continent, in charge of the Treasury Department. The first question was, where's the money going to come from? And since this was a nation of mostly farmers, the only thing you could tax to generate revenue, really, was incoming trade, foreign trade. So Congress imposed an 8% tariff on imports, and that was considered enough to run the government, and it was for a while. Congress also created the Customs Service to collect the money when ships arrived. We needed a court system because the only thing the Constitution says was there should be a Supreme Court and any other federal courts that Congress feels like creating. And so what they felt like was a district court in each state and 3 intermediate appeals courts. We had an army of 1,000 men. That's pretty intimidating. Figure out the money, so decimal coinage, the dollars and cents we still have today. They created a mint. How do you become a citizen? When you come here, you have to be a resident for 2 years. Now, many of the founders would have been, in fulfillment of the obligation from the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, the Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which authorized federal courts to issue orders to help capture and return fugitive slaves. So Not only did the Constitution say that fugitives were to be returned, but now it's the law of the land. Now, there were a lot of people among the founding generation that thought that was enough, and you always have to ask yourself, what do we want the government to do? Because there are all sorts of answers to that question. And the prevailing answers have changed a lot over time. But back then, it wasn't clear that the government needed to do a whole lot more. The one thing I'd put left off the list was the post office system. So they did have to do that. But Alexander Hamilton at the Treasury Department had a much broader vision of what the government could do. So he started writing these lengthy reports that he delivered to Congress. There he is, looking quite dashing. And his first one was on the subject of public credit, or the public debt. As I mentioned 2 weeks ago, the national government and the states were all heavily in debt left over from the Revolutionary War. They had all issued notes that were at this point, they might say that the state of Massachusetts had to pay $100 if you redeemed the note, but in fact, nobody believed that would happen, so notes were being traded at like 10% of their face value. Hamilton wanted to pay off all the people who held the debt at the full face value. What he wanted to do was make sure that the wealthy creditors in the country were loyal to the government because they had a financial stake in the government. He also, this is a world without much money. The government was going to coin some gold and silver, but not a lot, because we didn't have a lot. So how do you pay for things? How does your economy work? And Hamilton was thinking of ways to create money. And one of them was the national government would promise to pay off the debt at full value. It would issue notes to everybody. And people would trade the notes. I've got this promise from the government to pay me $100. I don't need it today, but I really do want those shoes. So, I'll use my note and buy whatever I want. That was Hamilton's idea. Jefferson and Madison, James Madison, his top political advisor, thought this was a terrible idea. The notes had originally gone to soldiers and shopkeepers and farmers to pay for things during the Revolution. And those poor people had to part with the notes years earlier to buy things they needed. The people who were holding them now were speculators who would scoop them up at bargain prices. Jefferson and Madison didn't think that was fair, and they also wanted a credit because some of the states, like Virginia, had done the honorable thing and repaid their debt, and other states, like Massachusetts, had not done so. So there's a big battle in Congress, and one day Jefferson is walking around downtown New York, and he bumps into Hamilton, and Hamilton is just looking despondent. And so they start talking about this impasse over the public debt. Jefferson decides they can reach a deal, so he decides to invite Hamilton and Madison to dinner. And they had a nice dinner in downtown New York, and they agreed on a compromise. That Jefferson and Madison would accept Hamilton's plan, and in exchange, Hamilton and George Washington would get the government to start building a new capital down on the Potomac River. It happened to be not very far from Mount Vernon, which made George Washington happy, partly because he lived there and partly because he'd scooped up a lot of land on the Potomac cheap and was hoping the property values would go up. Also, Southerners wanted the capital in the slave country so that people on the street wouldn't harass them if they were walking along with their slaves. That sort of thing happened in New York City because some residents of New York thought it was awful to see slaves. So the folks from down south thought, well, let's go down to the Potomac there, we'll be safe, we won't be harassed. So Congress assumed everybody's debts, the federal government and all the state government debts, and then started issuing notes like this one, which happens to be payable to George Washington. It must be one of the very earliest ones. They all paid 6% interest, so you could just sit and collect the interest, or you could use them to buy things. And at first, $4 out of $5 raised by the tariff went to pay the interest on the debt. But it was considered a way of putting the country on a sound financial footing. And in fact, it worked really well. In just a few years, the United States had a better credit rating than any country in Europe, which when you think about it is pretty remarkable, since we were basically a nation of farmers. And there were so many people trading in government bonds that the folks who were doing most of the trading, who happened to hang out on Wall Street, decided to come up with some rules for how the bond trading should work. And the agreement that they reached in 1794 or so, I've forgotten the year now, gasp, is the genesis of the New York Stock Exchange. Those guys trading bonds created the institution we still have today. Now, Hamilton's second report was on banking. And as I have mentioned, there weren't any banks. Hamilton thought the nation needed a bank. It needed, for one thing, a place to put the government's money. So let's have a national bank that can hold the money. And then, because it would have assets, it could also issue notes that people would buy and sell and use as currency. You'd get one. It would say it was redeemable in gold or silver, but if you didn't need the gold or silver right now, you could use the notes to buy things. That was Hamilton's idea. And once again, Jefferson and Madison disagreed. They had a simple constitutional argument. There's a list of things in Article 1 as to what Congress can do, and they're very specific. And that list does not include organizing a bank. So as far as they were concerned, you can't do it. Hamilton took a much broader view of what the government could do. He claimed, the government has power over currency, and this is kind of related to currency. And then he relied on that necessary and proper clause I mentioned a couple weeks ago. At the end of that list, it says Congress can do anything else that is necessary and proper for doing the other things. And that is a huge loophole. Washington accepted Hamilton's view of that loophole, and Congress ended up creating a bank with a 20-year charter, and that's the original bank building, a nice imposing structure in Philadelphia. Now, within only a few years, as I've already suggested, you've got a serious debate between Hamilton and Washington and Jefferson and Madison about what the government should be doing. What's it allowed to do? What would be good? What's good public policy? They were not prepared for this because going through the Revolution and the constitutional period, the drafting period, this elite generation of people all sort of thought there was a public interest, we all know what it is, and we will pursue it. But suddenly, if you've got a disagreement, what does that make the opposing side? You know what's in the public interest. Those people are selfish. They're only pursuing their own interest. Both sides were shocked that this was happening, and the level of rhetoric pumped up. Those may not look like much, but those are the nation's first political newspapers. Hamilton had a guy on the payroll at the Treasury Department printing the one on the left. Jefferson had a guy who only spoke English hired as a translator in the State Department who was really just publishing the one on the right. Obviously, they didn't have illustrations yet, but they really knew something about political polemics. We have nothing on these people. They really knew how to insult each other. It was vicious, and it stooped to the personal level. They were both trading charges of immorality. As it happened, Hamilton had indeed fathered an illegitimate child, and as it happened, Thomas Jefferson had indeed fathered children with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. Those rumors were out there, and they were actively thrown around by these newspapers. And we found ourselves with a political party system that no one had anticipated. Hamilton's people kept on using that label Federalist. They wanted a stronger national government. They wanted the government to do active things to encourage economic growth. And they assumed that well-heeled white men such as themselves should be running the show. Jefferson's supporters started using labels like Republican and Democratic. And in the lingo of the time, Republican meant you didn't want a monarchy. And there were charges that Hamilton was scheming to turn the presidency into a hereditary position that would soon become a king. The political paranoia was rampant in the 1790s. And then the Democratic word just meant we're of the people, we're not elitists. Jefferson's people sounded more kind of populist, but they too were run by the wealthy. It was rich landowners on the Hudson River Valley and rich plantation owners down in Virginia and Maryland and South Carolina who ran the Democratic Republican Party. Now these are not party, I'm using the word because people mostly use the word party, but this is not a political party the way we think of. This is just factions within the elite. There aren't any party organizations. You don't become a member of the Federalist Party. They didn't have platforms. They didn't go campaigning for public office. All those wonderful things were going to come a few decades later. Now, 1792, Washington was reelected unanimously. When it got 4 years later, he absolutely wanted to retire to Mount Vernon. So he left after 2 terms, which set an unofficial precedent that lasted until Franklin Roosevelt in 1940. So the 1796 election is the first one to be contested. The Federalist candidate there is John Adams from Massachusetts. He was the obvious candidate partly because Hamilton was born in the West Indies and Hamilton was not eligible under the Constitution. You have to be a natural-born citizen to be president. So Hamilton couldn't run. Adams was the choice. I found 2 portraits of him sort of before 1796 and after. You can kind of try to imagine what he looked like in the middle. And of course, go back here. Jefferson was the obvious candidate for the Republicans. And now we can have electoral maps. Look familiar? Right? We're going to see a lot of those in 2024, which is a scary thought. Okay, so you can see clearly a regional division already with the Federalists in the Northeast and the Atlantic coast and the Republicans in the backcountry and down south. Now, you could say that the Electoral College worked exactly the way the framers of the Constitution wanted. The 2 best known and perhaps best qualified people in the country, if you were looking at wealthy white men, of course, they're the president and the vice president. They came in first and second. But Adams comes in first by a few votes. And so you've got Adams as president, Jefferson as vice president, the best political talent in the country, and that they hated each other. According to Jefferson, Adams never spoke to him about government business after the inauguration. So he went 4 years without consulting his vice president about anything. Now, foreign policy took center stage while Adams was president. It's not the place to go into the French Revolution particularly, but the 1790s were a very lively period in Europe where the French overthrew the king, executed the king, set up a republic, and then found themselves at war with every monarchy in Europe. Massive, very large war. And Britain was involved against the French, of course. Both sides used their navies to try to prevent the other side from getting foreign trade. So both navies were interfering with American shipping, stopping them in the water, forcing them to turn back, seizing cargo. It was a lot of interference. The Federalists preferred Britain in this struggle. As Hamilton put it, we think in English. We're closer to the British than we are to the French. And many of the Federalists wanted a war with France, and the Jefferson newspapers attacked that rather viciously. And so the Federalists, you can forget about the First Amendment. Here we are, it's only 8 years into things, 10 years into things. Congress, run by the Federalists, stamps down on this public dissent. First thing, this will sound familiar, they gave the president blank power to toss out any foreigner he thought was dangerous. You can imagine some recent presidents who would have loved to have that power. And the Sedition Act, you could go to jail or have to pay a fine for false, scandalous, or malicious statements about the president or Congress. Now, one thing you note there is they're not protecting the vice president, who happens to be Jefferson. So they can slam him all they want, and the Sedition Act doesn't cover that. This was serious stuff. 25 editors were arrested, 10 of them were convicted. The 3 leading Democratic Republican newspapers were shut down. I mean, this is kind of like President Trump going after the New York Times or President Biden going after Fox News. I mean, this is really stamping down on public criticism. Jefferson and Madison were so upset that they wrote resolutions that were adopted by the Kentucky and Virginia legislatures. And we're only into this for 10 years, and their theory is the Constitution is just an agreement between sovereign states. No we the people any longer. It's just an agreement among the states. Each state can decide for itself if the federal government has gone too far, and so each state can decide for itself whether it wants to follow federal law. Now, that's a bad sign, right? You've got the vice president making an argument that would tear the country apart because half the states would decide not to follow what the other half were doing. Madison and Jefferson were actually ahead of the curve on this one, and the other state legislatures rejected their ideas, and so the idea of nullification went into political storage for a few decades until John Calhoun and the Southern slave owners resurrected, which we'll find in a couple of weeks. Now, right before the election of 1800, the government moves to Washington, which was simply a large swamp, a terrible place to live, apparently, marshy and lots of mosquitoes. It's a rerun of 1796, and the parties invented geographical balance. Adams and the Federalists recommended that Charles Pinckney of South Carolina be elected vice president, and Thomas Jefferson and the Southerners recommended that Aaron Burr, a leading Republican in New York, be elected as vice president. So you had tickets. You had tickets now. Adams would have won except for the shameful deal made at the Constitutional Convention giving the Southern states an extra 3/5 of a vote for every slave. Without that, John Adams would have been reelected, and the history of the country would have been obviously quite different. But instead, thanks to the extra votes, Jefferson won, and that's the alliance you can kind of see there between the South and New York State was the majority political alliance for the next 25 years. So Jefferson wins, you'd think, except there's just one problem. One of the Federalist electors did the sensible thing and voted for somebody else other than Pinckney, so that Pinckney did not get the same number of votes as John Adams. The Republicans were not so smart. Nobody thought that one of them should probably cast a vote for somebody other than Aaron Burr, or we're going to have a tie. Well, that's exactly what happened. That's the original tally sheet of the electoral votes. Jefferson and Burr are tied at 73. Under the rules, the election goes to the House of Representatives, and it's the old one not the one that was just elected, but the lame duck House of Representatives, which the Federalists controlled. So the Federalists had the lovely choice of, do we go with Jefferson or do we go with Aaron Burr, both of whom were largely despised. But finally, Hamilton did the sensible thing and realized you could at least trust Jefferson to try to do the right thing. No one could trust Burr with anything. And so after 36 ballots, Hamilton threw his support for Jefferson, and Jefferson won. One immediate result of that was the 12th Amendment, so that there are separate electoral counts for president and vice president. So we can't have a tie like that again, at least not that kind of tie. So there he is, President Jefferson, with a famous portrait by Charles Wilson Peale. Now, this is really pretty impressive, especially considering how much political hatred had been thrown around during the 1790s. It was a completely peaceful transfer of power. Nobody charged the Capitol. Nobody pulled out their rifles. The Federalists stood by and let their opponents take over because the people had spoken, or at least, the wealthy white men who got to pick electors had spoken. But it was peaceful, which, considering upcoming events, God only knows. But at least they were able to do it peacefully back then. Jefferson tried to be really conciliatory in his inaugural address. He said, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We are all Republicans and we are all Federalists. And he promised a wise and frugal government that would leave people alone to do what they wanted to do for themselves. Congress slashed the budget. You got to the point where almost the only thing the government was doing was running post offices, and there were 900 of them. At that point, early in Jefferson's first term, the Federalists lose their best-known leader, other than John Adams. People still dueled back then. And Hamilton and Aaron Burr had traded insults for quite a while, and finally got to the point that Aaron Burr challenged him to a duel. Dueling was technically illegal, so they got in a boat, crossed the Hudson, and found themselves in Weehawken, which at the time was a fairly empty area. So nobody was going to see them have the duel in Weehawken. Hamilton fires in the air to miss. Aaron Burr does not fire in the air. And he hit Hamilton, and Hamilton died a few days later. Burr then skipped the country, which is, to have the vice president skip the country because he's just killed somebody in a duel, does remind us that was a different age. Now, the war in Europe was continuing. At this point, Napoleon was running France, and he was happily taking his army up and down the continent, conquering almost everybody. The French and the British ships were still interfering with our merchant ships. The British liked to stop an American ship, claim that there were British deserters on board, and then just seize them and carry them off, even when they weren't British deserters at all. They were basically kidnapping American sailors to put them into the Royal Navy. Jefferson's response, faced with what England and France are doing, he optimistically thought they need our trade so much that if we don't sell them anything, they will back down and behave. So Congress passed the Embargo Act. No ship could leave an American port to go to another country. That was the idea. Value of legal shipping went down 80%. Customs receipts plummeted, naturally. And there was an awful lot of cheating, particularly up here in New England, and also in New York. So by the time 1808 rolled around, Jefferson had his fill of the presidency and was happy to retire to Monticello. His supporters in Congress picked James Madison as their candidate to succeed Jefferson. He'd been Jefferson's closest advisor for years and also Secretary of State. That is his estate down in Montpelier, Virginia, where he had 100 slaves. He was a fairly successful, actually well-successful tobacco farmer. The Federalists picked Charles Pinckney from South Carolina, and as you can see, it's a pretty convincing win for Madison. It's a little closer than 1804 because some people were upset about the embargo, but all things considered, it was a convincing victory for the Republicans in Madison. On the other hand, the British continued to seize our ships, and over the next several years, Madison was under more and more pressure to try to do something about it. And at this point, it seemed like the British were the bigger threat. And in the summer of 1812, Madison finally had enough and asked Congress to declare war on Great Britain. That is a published version of his war message plus an announcement. He had 4 reasons for going to war with Britain. They're stealing our sailors, and the estimate was about 5,000 guys got shanghaied off of these ships and forced into the British Navy. They had unfairly declared a naval blockade around the United States. They kept invading our waters, and he claimed they were stirring up trouble with the American Indians up in the Great Lakes area. There was little evidence for that one, but that was kind of a volatile charge at the time. Remarkably, just after he declares war, we have to have another election. It's 1812. The governor of New York ran as an anti-war candidate, and he did reasonably well, George DeWitt Clinton. But Madison was reelected. You can see every state that had a lot of active shipping, where all the ports are, those are the states that voted for Clinton. Now, the war itself, you're probably not going to be able to read those maps, but I'll translate. The war of 1812 was fought in two parts of the country. Up in western New York and along the Great Lakes, you had British troops coming in from Canada. You had American troops heading up to try to liberate Canada. And it was kind of a stalemate. Each side had some wins and losses up on the Great Lakes and the Canadian border. But then the British also decided to invade the Chesapeake, and that's still on the left side there. They land 5,000 troops on Chesapeake Bay, and not a single state militia shows up to stop them. Okay, that's the sort of lack of enthusiasm for the war effort, you could say. So the British just marched their way into Washington. Nobody stops them. They set fire to the White House and the Capitol. James and Dolly Madison had to flee. Servants cut out the famous portrait of George Washington, rolled it up, and put it in a wagon to get out for safekeeping. They left so fast they left dinner on the table, and the British officers happily sat down and had dinner, and no doubt toasted the Madisons. Then the British moved up in the direction of Baltimore. There's an engraving of them burning the White House. They get up to Baltimore, and finally they are stopped. That is an early painting of the bombardment of Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor. And one of the spectators was Francis Scott Key, who penned new lyrics to an old melody and turned out the Star-Spangled Banner. So that's the bombardment that song is talking about. Now, the British finally defeated Napoleon. They could have turned all their attention on us and totally destroyed us, but British taxpayers had been paying for war for 25 years, and they'd had enough. So the British said, enough, that's okay, let's settle. And a treaty was signed in late 1814. The American representative was John Quincy Adams, who's there in the center. And it was basically simply a return to the status quo. Didn't address any of the grievances in Madison's message, Didn't say anything about sailors or American Indians. Now, if the enemy invades your country, burns your national capital, and then the peace treaty just says turn the clock back to beforehand, that's not a win, right? But Americans have always felt they won the War of 1812, and one of the main reasons was that the British, I'll go back another one, and the right there also landed an army on the Gulf of Mexico near New Orleans. And because communications were slow, the peace treaty had already been signed when the British arrived at New Orleans. So there's going to be a battle down there. And Andrew Jackson of Tennessee was in charge of the local militia. He recruited every guy with a rifle he could find, including the local pirates, who were happy to help out because they had no love for the British Navy. The actual battle, the British troops coming up a hill, the battle took 5 minutes. Jackson's people unloaded everything they had. The British lost 2,000 men instantly, including their 2 top generals who were killed. Jackson only had 60 casualties. It was a huge, huge victory. And Jackson's win left pretty much every ordinary American with the view that we took on the world's biggest military power and we kicked their whatever, fill in the blank. This was national pride really grew after the War of 1812, despite some of the things that had really happened. Now, I want to talk a bit about how the country was growing in these years. People keep moving over the Appalachians and heading toward the Mississippi River. Economic activity on the river is increasing, and then that area received quite a boost. In 1802, Spain blocked New Orleans to American ships so that we couldn't send anything down the Mississippi River and out through the Gulf of Mexico. Napoleon happened to control Spain at the time, so Jefferson sent James Monroe to France with instructions to pay $10 million for the right to trade through New Orleans on the Mississippi River. $10 million just for trading privileges. But Napoleon had other things on his mind and decided to sell the whole thing. And for just another $1.5 million, Napoleon sold all of that to us. $11.5 million for everything that Spain, on that part of Spain and France claimed. It doubled the size of the U.S. overnight. Well, now that Jefferson has bought this area, he needs to know what's in it, so he sends out explorers. And the most famous are Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. They followed, I hope you can see it on the map, they followed the red line, going up the Missouri River and then across through the Rockies, down the Columbia River, and they made it to the Pacific Ocean. It took them 2 years to go down and come back. The fact that they'd even made it to the Pacific gave America a kind of questionable claim to that whole region of the North Pacific coast. In the meantime, a general named Zebulon Pike was doing his exploring. He went all the way up the Mississippi River. He went way through the Rockies. He has a mountain named for him. And when he came back, he came back and reported that you couldn't use the Great Plains for anything. It was too dry. It was just prairie grass. It had no economic potential. And the view that the Great Plains, you went through the Great Plains, you didn't stop there. That view lasted for several decades. As the white settlers keep moving, of course, the American Indian tribes keep getting pushed back. And then we grew, there's a map showing you how much land the Indians lost between the start and 1830. So you can remember, when the first European colonists landed, that whole area was already filled with people who considered it home. And between the illnesses I talked about, disease killed 80% of the Indians at least. Between that and American or white settler rifles, by 1830, they'd really been pushed up back to the Mississippi and across, with little pockets on reservations in the east. James Quincy Adams, who was Secretary of State, negotiated a couple of treaties on behalf of Monroe. One with Britain set up the Canadian arc border with Canada running all the way to the Pacific. That blue line at the top hadn't been on a map before, but through this treaty, that became the line running from the Great Lakes to the Oregon Territory. And Adams also made a treaty with Spain that drew a line between the part we got in the Louisiana Purchase and the part that Spain held on to. The federal government encouraged people to head west, of course, paying no attention to the folks who already lived there. And the government kept making it easier and easier to buy land. The minimum purchase kept going down, the price per acre kept going down, and the government set up what were called land offices to sell the public land. There used to be an expression to do land office business, and these are the offices they were referring to. This was an amazing opportunity for ordinary people to buy their own land. It's estimated that more people acquired their own farms, their own land, during the next 30 years than in all of human history otherwise. You have this vast area that from the white settler perspective is empty, and let's go out there and carve out an area for us to farm. Now, how do you travel around this country? Remember, it was all trees. So unless you lived near a river, it was hard to travel over the interior of the country. There was an incentive to build canals as one way to get around. One of the very first one was right around here, the Middlesex Canal. Does anybody know about the Middlesex Canal? Yeah. It took them about 10 years to build. It opened in 1803. It covered 27 miles from the Merrimack up near where Lowell is today, down to Boston. Goes through Billerica, Wilmington, Woburn, Winchester, the Mystic Lakes in Medford. It ran right along those, right where the Lowell train runs today. That was the route of the canal. And then Somerville, and finally ends up at Charlestown. One of the things that the canal did was to take away shipping from Newburyport. Up until the canal, people sailed things down the Merrimack and came out at Newburyport. But now you could use the canal to go straight to Boston, and it was faster. The most famous canal, of course, is the Erie Canal. The state of New York built it, took them 10 years, 363 miles from Albany to Lake Erie. And this was an overnight success. Imagine, to ship 1 ton of grain from Buffalo to New York City, before the canal it cost $100. With the canal it cost $5. You suddenly have so much traffic coming from the Great Lakes area as it develops, through the canal, down the Hudson to New York City, that the combination of that traffic and the fact that New York has a wonderful harbor turned New York into the biggest port in the country. And quickly New York became the biggest city in the country. As it turned out, it became easier to head upriver thanks to Robert Fulton, looking rather dashing there, actually. He looks sort of like a Lord Byron or one of those romantic poets. Fulton made some improvements to the steam engine, put it on a boat, created the Claremont there, and it could sail up the Hudson against the current. It took 32 hours to get from New York to Albany, but that was way faster than doing it without steam. Within 2 years, a guy named Cornelius Vanderbilt was running regular ferry service between Staten Island and New York City with little steamboats. That ferry service was the beginning of the Vanderbilt Empire. That leads through the New York Central and lots of other things. The American economy is also growing. This is a period, this first 25 years of the 19th century is a period where everything seems to be growing. And that includes literally people were growing more crops, and in particular, they were growing more cotton. As I mentioned before, up until through the Revolution, people weren't really growing cotton or using it because there was only one variety of plant that you could grow, but it only liked the sandy soil right on the coast. You couldn't plant them inland. There was a different kind of cotton that you could plant inland, but it had lots and lots of seeds. It was too expensive to try to pull out all the seeds. It took forever. So that kind of cotton was fairly useless until Eli Whitney there, who grew up in Westboro, Massachusetts, developed his cotton gin. Gin is short for engine, so his cotton engine. It could separate the seeds from the fiber. It made one person 25 times more productive. And suddenly, planters in the South could grow a form of cotton that is very happy in the Deep South. Hot and dry is the climate that short staple cotton wants, and the Deep South had a lot of that. Now, you can't eat cotton, so what do you do with it? As it happened, across the Atlantic, something known as the Industrial Revolution was happening. And one aspect of the Industrial Revolution in Britain was using steam to power machinery. Another aspect of it was the development of machines to spin and weave cotton. And there were a lot of them in Britain, and they were a market for American cotton. The British tried to keep their new technology from crossing the Atlantic, but they didn't succeed, and the Industrial Revolution came to America in the unlikely spot of Pawtucket, Rhode Island. A fellow named Samuel Slater, who had worked in spinning mills in England, emigrated over here with the designs for the machines in his head. And once he got here, he found Moses Brown, a prominent, wealthy Providence businessman. And with Brown's money, he built Slater Mill. Was the first water-powered machinery for spinning cotton yarn. You can still visit it. There it is. And he had 9 workers in his mill, and all of them were boys under the age of 12. Okay, this is an era of child labor, and little boys are smaller, and it's easier for them to scurry around under the machinery to fix things. The machinery was powered by water. You needed, as you can see, the spillover there on that next to the mill. And New England had lots of good rivers. In 1814, a fellow named Francis Cabot Lowell, there are some famous last names for you, the Cabots and the Lowells. Francis Cabot Lowell opened the Boston Manufacturing Company, it's up there on the top, in Waltham. And it was the first building to combine spinning cotton, weaving cotton, and then finishing the cloth so that it was ready to go. It was the first completely mechanized factory in the country for making cotton. Now, as you probably all know, the Charles River doesn't really have a strong current, but the Merrimack does. And fairly soon, Lowell's family and his business built their own new community up on the Merrimack. At the time, it was in East Chelmsford, but eventually became its own city of Lowell. And it was the first planned industrial complex in the country. Most of the workers, like in that engraving, most of the workers are young women. You can pay young women less than you'd have to pay a young man. They have small, delicate fingers, and a lot of the work involves like reattaching thread when it becomes loose in one of the machines. So women were the labor source of choice, young single women who lived in dormitories up there because it was a moral age and they weren't allowed out much. You can tour them. I actually did tour one once. Mills sprouted up all over New England. And all you have to, drive around up near the Merrimack or even, Maine, New Hampshire, in almost any river with any size to it, is going to have little mills in all the little towns. American cotton production took off. The combination of the cotton gin, and all the new factories in New England, production of cotton cloth went up incredibly, and cotton was the single largest American export. Where do you grow the cotton? Now that you don't have to be on the coast, you grow it in the upper regions, the sort of the hill country in the Carolinas and Georgia, and you start growing it in pockets out further west in Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana and Tennessee, places where the climate was good. Slaves start being carried to these other regions that had been fairly empty before. We'll come back to that in a second. Okay, Jefferson's political group kind of split over the lessons of the War of 1812, and some of them came around to the idea that Alexander Hamilton was right. The government needs to do some things to help stimulate the economy and support the government itself. John Quincy Adams was one of those Republicans. So was a fellow named Henry Clay. And the new Republicans who controlled Congress after the war imposed a tariff that was specifically designed to be so big that it would protect American manufacturing from British imports. You can either use a tariff just to raise money, or you can use it to keep out stuff you don't want sold here so that the people who make it here have a better chance of selling their goods. And the Republicans also chartered another Bank of the United States. They had let the first one lapse. They chartered a second one that was even bigger than Hamilton's and even more imposing building in Philadelphia, made to resemble the Parthenon. And that is still there. I once had a hotel room that looked directly down on top of it. 1816, the Democratic Republicans in Congress pick yet another Virginia slaveholder, James Monroe, to be the next candidate because Madison was going to retire. Monroe had a pretty impressive resume. He attended the Continental Congress. He'd been a senator from Virginia. He'd been governor of Virginia. He'd been Secretary of War and Secretary of State twice. And he negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. He also owned 75 slaves on that estate in Oak Hill in Virginia. The Federalists pick Rufus King, who was a senator from New York, and you can hardly find the Federalists on that map. By this point, King only gets electoral votes from 4 states. By 1816, the Federalists look very old-fashioned. Their sort of elitist approach to politics has been left way behind as the country has grown and the Jefferson people have appealed to larger elements of the population. The Federalists were essentially dead. In 1820, the Federalists were so dead that nobody ran against Monroe. You don't need a map for 1820. He got every vote except one. One elector decided it wouldn't do for anyone else to be unanimous after George Washington, so one elector cast a vote for somebody else. It was a newspaper in Boston that coined the expression an era of good feeling to describe the popular support for Monroe during these years. Monroe's presidency is remembered for 2 things. The first, of course, is the Monroe Doctrine, which wasn't actually written by Monroe. It was written by John Quincy Adams. What happens is in the 1820s, very large sections of South America and Central America rebel against the Spanish and start forming new republic governments up and down that part of the hemisphere. America is delighted that we have more republics in the Western Hemisphere, but there was a fear that the monarchies in Europe would try to help Spain get all those places back. So John Quincy Adams, who was the Secretary of State, wrote a statement for Monroe in his annual message to Congress, which said, "We don't care about what happens in Europe. You can do whatever you want to each other, but this hemisphere is not a proper subject for European colonization. And if European countries interfere in this hemisphere, we will consider it dangerous to our peace and safety," whatever that meant. This is basically the United States, a third world country, claiming this is our hemisphere, leave it alone. And amazingly, the European powers didn't call our bluff. If the British and the French had decided they wanted colonies in South America, you can bet we couldn't have stopped them. But they kind of humored America and didn't call our bluff, and so the Monroe Doctrine has lasted in the nation's lore for exactly 200 years, more than 200 years. The second reason to remember Monroe's presidency is the Missouri Compromise. In 1819, the good people of Maine had had enough of being governed by Massachusetts, and so the good people of Maine decided they wanted to be their own state. So they applied for statehood, 1819, and there were enough settlers in Missouri that it also applied for statehood. A congressman from New York proposed to admit Missouri as a state with a prohibition on slavery. As you can imagine, that produced quite a debate in Congress, and the debate went on for months. Finally, Henry Clay of Kentucky brokered a compromise, and the compromise was Maine was admitted as a free state, Missouri was admitted as a slave state, a state where the laws of Missouri could have slavery if they wanted to, but the rest of the unorganized territory, which is in kind of orangish on that map, the rest of it was closed to slavery. Now, on the face of it, it looks like, boy, they really cleared a whole large portion of the country to keep slavery out. But it's not quite as impressive as it seems, because remember, nobody really expected anyone to live in the part there that's called unorganized territory. That's the Great Plains. It's too dry. You can't really live there. So there wasn't an expectation in the South that, oh no, we're going to be swallowed up by new free states. So the Southerners accepted it. The Congress went on its merry way. Thomas Jefferson was terrified. He wrote to a friend after the Missouri Compromise had been passed, "This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once the death knell of the Union. As it is, we have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation is in the other." Self-preservation for white people, of course, is what he meant. Jefferson apparently disliked the institution of slavery, but somehow managed to never sell his slaves, to have children with at least one of them, and to the extent to which that was consensual. He was conflicted. On one level, he knew it was wrong, and on more important levels, really, it was too important to not have. All right, we're up to the end of the class, just about. 1824 comes along. Monroe's had 2 terms. There were 2 favorites to succeed Monroe among the political elite in the country. John Quincy Adams there on the left, Henry Clay on the right, from Kentucky. He had been Speaker of the House of Representatives. They actually didn't disagree too much about policy. They both wanted to use the government's power to develop the national economy. But they did not have the election to themselves because there was also this guy named Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was something completely new and different. He was born in the backwoods of Carolina. Two of his brothers died fighting the British, and Jackson himself was a prisoner of war at the age of 12. He had quite the youth. He left a trail of drinking, gambling, duels, and fallen women across from the Carolinas into Tennessee. He became the first public prosecutor in Tennessee at the age of 21. Apparently, you didn't need to know a lot of law to have that position. He was elected Tennessee's first congressman, and then he didn't like politics. He didn't like government, so he retired from politics and became a very successful cotton farmer near Nashville. That's his estate. He became famous as a military hero. I've already mentioned the Battle of New Orleans. He also led American forces to defeat the Creek Indians in Alabama and the Seminole Indians in Florida, forcing them to surrender a lot of land. This guy is the first candidate to run as an outsider who wants to clean up the mess in Washington. Obviously not the last, but definitely the first. He's a popular hero who represents a complete backlash against a system in which people chosen by the upper crust get to take turns being president. He is new and different. John Quincy Adams, who was something of a snob, said, "General Jackson is a barbarian who could not write a sentence of grammar and could hardly spell his own name." Later on, when Harvard College awarded an honorary degree to Jackson, Adams refused to show up. This election was handled on a more democratic, popular basis than any other. By now, 18 of the states choose their presidential electors by popular vote. Many of the states had made it possible for almost all white men to vote. This is the first election where you can actually have a popular vote total. And as you can see, the results, it's quite a checkerboard compared to the ones I've shown you so far. But you can see a regional pattern. Adams naturally does well in New England. Clay naturally does well in the Midwest around Kentucky. There were some Southerners who voted for a fellow named William Crawford, who no one remembers. And Jackson had the broadest appeal. He won most of the South. He did well in the Mid-Atlantic. He got the most popular votes with 43%. He also got the most electoral votes. And there's the count there. A little hard to read, but he got the most electoral votes. The problem was he did not get a majority of them because there were so many candidates running. So once again, an election goes to the House of Representatives. Under the Constitution, the House picks from the top 3 vote-getters. That left Henry Clay out. So Henry Clay is the deal maker, and he throws his support for Adams. The House votes by states, and Adams wins. Soon after, Adams appoints Clay to be Secretary of State. Ooh. And it's not the case today, but back then, being Secretary of State was a stepping stone to the presidency. Jefferson had been it, Madison had been it, Monroe had been it, John Quincy Adams had been it. It looks like Clay is the anointed successor. Jackson's people were furious, as you can imagine. Jackson called it a corrupt bargain and referred to Clay as the Judas of the West, who has closed the contract and received his 30 pieces of silver. Biblical reference there. What you had in Washington was, for the first time, you had a president facing a Congress controlled by the other party. Now We're used to that, but that hadn't happened before, and Adams couldn't get anything done with the Jackson people in Congress. So the stage is set for a rematch in 1828, which we'll get to next week. My closing anecdote, I love this. We can treat 1826 as the end of this first era in the nation's history. By that point, John Adams is 90, and he's living in the family home in Quincy. Thomas Jefferson is 83. He's down in Monticello. Those are portraits relatively late in life for both of them. And over the last 20 years, they'd renewed their acquaintance and traded lots of interesting letters with each other, reminiscing about the Revolution and the things that they'd been through. They became friends again. And both of them in 1826 were seriously ill. Adams wants to hold on until July 4th. And for the week beforehand, he's on his deathbed, but the week beforehand, as he stirs himself, is it the 4th yet? No, Mr. President, I'm sorry, it's not. Days of that. Finally, Adams survives to July 4th. He died that afternoon, and his last words were apparently, "Jefferson still lives." I guess he was still grumpy about some things. But Adams was wrong, because only a few hours earlier, down in Monticello, Thomas Jefferson had breathed his last. The two of them died on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's a wonderful story. So on that note, we're going to end for today. Next week, we're going to find out what America was like when Andrew Jackson finally gets to take over. And so next week, again, it's Wednesday at 2 o'clock. So thank you all.